about the CIA, and does the CIA secretly stand for the Catholic Intelligence Agency? The Catholic Intelligence Agency. Is that possible? Well, interestingly enough, that's not my assertion. That assertion comes from a publication called the Catholic Herald. A Catholic publication gives the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, they call it both the Catholics in Action or the Catholic Intelligence Agency. That's their nickname for it. But we're going to talk about that as we move forward in the show. Before that, I want us to go to Revelation chapter 17 and try to establish some biblical context for our view of Rome for any new listeners, where we read in Revelation 17 and verse 3, where John says, So he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast. And down in verse 5, it says, And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Then we move over to verse 18, and obviously we're skipping around here, but we read in verse 18, And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. The woman is that great city that reigneth over the kings of the earth. Now, 2,000 years ago, what city was it that was reigning over the kings of the earth? In reality, there was only one. And most all ancient historians and biblical commentators seem to agree that city was Rome. And it would appear, based upon the record of history, that that same city continues to manipulate the kings of the earth, however, from an unofficial position. In other words, there's manipulation. That's why we have the woman riding the beast. Just like you think of a person riding a horse, they sit on the horse and they hold the reins and they, direct the horse to the left, to the right, and so on to go forward, etc. And so we've got a woman riding on this scarlet-colored beast, and the woman is that great city, Mystery Babylon the Great. Is that what's really going on with this activity that we keep hearing about in the news about the deep state and how the deep state is resisting the administration of President Donald Trump? And part of the reason I wanted to do this show is because of the testimony of this FBI agent, Peter Strzok, rather. His name has somewhat of a peculiar spelling, S-T-R-Z-O-K, but it is pronounced Strzok with a U, almost like a U sounding. Peter Strzok. Well, I'm reading up here on Agent Strzok with the FBI, and of course it says, quote, he earned a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, Jesuit headquarters, in 1991, as well as a master's degree in 2013. So then he goes into the Army, then he's in the FBI, etc. Then you also find out that one of Strzok's uncles is James Strzok, Father James Strzok, S.J., a Jesuit priest doing missionary work in East Africa. So he has a Jesuit in the family. He himself I'm assuming he's Catholic based upon these reports, and he was Jesuit educated at Georgetown University, with obviously a close connection to the Jesuits through his uncle. Significant enough for it to be mentioned on Wikipedia. Why else would anybody mention it if it weren't some kind of a significant... Now, of course, Wikipedia is not giving a conspiracy theory, just pointing it out as information about Agent Peter Strzok. Very interesting that he's involved in this controversy here. Obviously, his bias was very, very anti-Trump. He did not want Trump to win the election. People, of course, have wondered if the deep state was involved tampering with the election. That is, of course, you would have to wonder about that, especially after the re-election of Barack Obama in 2012. where I don't know anybody who believes that Barack Obama was properly reelected in the 2012 election. I don't know anybody who thinks so. Most people that I have talked to or listened to who talk about that election where Obama beat Mitt Romney, they generally believe the election was rigged somehow because there were so many suspicious things going on. But anyway, and when you had the election in 2016 and Trump is running against Hillary, the one thing that those of us who do independent research fought, I mean, we're watching the numbers, watching the Trump campaign. Trump's bringing out tens of thousands of people. He has the overwhelming popularity and momentum, everything. Hillary's having a very difficult time getting people to come out and listen to her. She just did not have a dynamic campaign at all. And so I remember thinking and even saying, if we had an honest election, Trump would win. And Trump could win unless they rig the election, which many people suspected they were going to do. And then Trump started talking about it during his campaign. And the incredible thing is that you had President Obama come out and say that it was absurd for Trump to even suggest that an American election could be rigged, that was just ridiculous. There was absolutely no evidence that there could be any kind of election tampering, et cetera, et cetera. I remember comments from Hillary who said essentially the same thing. And then, of course, Trump wins. And now the Democrats and all those on the left who scoffed at the idea that the election could be tampered with somehow have spent all of this time, last 2 years, talking about Russia, the Russia collusion and meddling with the election and on and on and on, and election tampering and all the rest of it. I mean, it's incredible. But now we look at the situation with the deep state. We're hearing this over and over and over again. What is the problem with the deep state? Well, the problem could very well be that the deep state is manipulated, I believe, by Rome. Can we say that it's completely controlled by Rome? I don't think I can say that, but it is heavily manipulated by Rome. In fact, here's an article from 2 years ago in the Catholic Herald, and the headline is, quote, "Why Catholics Thrive in the CIA." Why Catholics thrive in the CIA. It says 3 out of the last 5 directors of the intelligence service have been Catholic. 3 out of 5. It says, this is all from the Catholic Herald, their article, and it says, quote, "The agency has been dubbed Catholics in Action." Now, the Catholics in Action, CIA, Catholics in Action. Think about that, brethren. So the Catholics are calling the CIA Catholics in Action. That's their nickname for it. So here's the quote. "The agency has been dubbed Catholics in Action because the faithful have occupied so many senior positions. But could their dominance be weakening?" That's what it says in the article. Now, of course, a lot of the Catholic domination of the CIA, just to briefly review the history, prior to the CIA, we had the OSS during World War II, the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was headed by Wild Bill Donovan, William Donovan. Donovan was a devout Roman Catholic and a Knight of Malta. Donovan ran the OSS. It is believed by not a few people that Donovan was responsible, for example, for the assassination of George Patton, General Patton, toward the end of the war. Reportedly because Patton, he beat the Nazis, he helped beat the Nazis in Europe. He did all of that, Patton's Third Army. He performed brilliantly and all the rest of it. But then at the end of the war, as the war was coming to a conclusion, he recognized that there was all this compromise with the communists in Russia, the Soviet Union, and so on, and that there was a lot of corruption going on. And what he was planning to do, reportedly, was once he was going to retire and get out of the army, and then he was going to basically blow the whistle, it is said, on all of this communist collusion going on between the United States government and the communists. And then right before he was going to give his resignation, etc., and get out of the army, he's in this Jeep accident where he gets hit by a truck, and then he is paralyzed, and then it's believed somebody came in and finished him off. These are the reports that are given, the stories that are told. Obviously, this is the unofficial version of how General Patton was killed. But nevertheless, it is said by not a few people that it was Wild Bill Donovan who gave the order to assassinate General Patton, because Donovan's deep state agenda was to favor communism. And of course, once you know the history of communism, we have our audio CD on the Jesuits and Marxism, weapon of the Counter-Reformation, because there is so much information about the development of communism that it was the Jesuits who developed it in the 19th century. They worked with Karl Marx. Because they were working with Karl Marx, because Otto von Bismarck in Germany believed they were working with Karl Marx, he expelled the Jesuits from Germany, kicked them out of the country, because he didn't trust them. He openly published their involvement with Marx. Now, of course, Marx denied it. There's an article, a Chicago Tribune article from back in the 19th century where he was interviewed, and he scoffed at the idea. But of course, all of the connections are there. And today, virtually all Jesuits are Marxists in one form or another. They're Marxist radicals, or they hold to radical Marxist, socialist, communist ideology. That's their ideology. And it's the inner doctrine of the Vatican. And if you study the Vatican, you learn this. So all of this becomes very important when you've got Catholics now working in the CIA and the FBI. When you've got so many Catholics involved in what everybody's calling the deep state. I mean, this is what they're talking about. But let's also remember something about the Vatican. The Vatican is said repeatedly, you go out there and dig around and do the research, you will find repeatedly it is said that the Vatican's intelligence network is the largest, the most extensive, and the most well-connected in the world. Anywhere. Way beyond our CIA. Remember, the CIA, what happened was you had the OSS with Wild Bill Donovan. Then Truman, it is said, President Truman, he comes in, FDR passes away, Truman takes over. Truman did not trust the OSS. It was the OSS that smuggled tens of thousands of Nazi war criminals out of Germany after the war, working with the Vatican, working with agents in Britain's MI6. And this is the subject of the documentary, The Last Refuge, Sam Donaldson. You can watch that documentary, but he explains all of this. This is what the Vatican rat lines are all about. And so Donovan was in charge of the OSS. So the OSS then, because Truman didn't trust them, thought they had too much power, he dissolves the OSS and he established the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. But the problem is, I mean, Truman, I think, had a good idea. The problem with it was that the people he put in charge of the CIA were the people who had been running the OSS. So basically the OSS was simply reinvented as the CIA. And it's from that point onward, toward the end of World War II, it's from then on that you find all of this strangeness going on in American politics. And of course, I believe it's because the Vatican and her Jesuits got control of our intelligence community. All right, let's go to we're talking about Rome, the Jesuits, struck, and the deep state. All of this activity going on. Prior to the break, we were talking about Wild Bill Donovan, William Donovan, and the OSS that then becomes the CIA. If you get the book, American Democracy and the Vatican, by Dr. Stephen Mumford, and you read that book, he talks about how the Vatican's involvement, his main argument in that book is about the Vatican's involvement in illegal immigration. And he says it's because of the Vatican's tampering with our politics, that's the reason nothing is ever done about illegal immigration. But he also talks about about how Catholics got control of the CIA. He talks about Donovan and how late in life, Wild Bill Donovan appears at the Vatican to receive the Vatican's highest honor for a lifetime of service to the papacy. Now just think about that. And again, I'm basing this on Mumford's book. If that's true, assuming all of that is true, and I don't have any reason to believe that it's not because it fits in with everything else that's going on, if all of that's true, yes, our intelligence community is being manipulated by Rome, if not fully controlled. But at the very least, manipulated. Obviously, they have to be careful with what they do. All right, well, let me read you a little bit more from this article here in the Catholic Herald with their headline, Why Catholics Thrive in the CIA. Why Catholics Thrive in the CIA. So they say this at one point. They say, quote, the CIA is the best known of the 17 agencies that comprise the American intelligence community. It has earned itself nicknames like Catholic Intelligence Agency and Catholics in Action. It's worth exploring why. And then it says, no official statistics exist on Catholics in the CIA or any other American intelligence agency. But one interesting clue is the relatively high number of Catholics who have served as director of the agency. So you've got Catholics who are often in charge. Here it goes on. It says, quote, 3 out of the last 5 CIA directors have been Catholic. Michael Hayden, Leon Panetta, and the current director, John Brennan. We're seeing John Brennan in the news now. He was the former director under Obama. So the article goes on. It says, quote, looking back, a number of Catholics led the agency in critical periods during the Cold War. Some of the most influential directors in CIA history have been Catholic, men such as Walter Bedell Smith, John McCone, William Colby, and William Casey. They were not just casual Catholics. They were devout mass-goers, in many cases members of groups like the Knights of Malta. The conspiracy theorists usually start there with nefarious plots about the Vatican steering world affairs. Of course, they never ask why an all-powerful Vatican can't engineer more Catholic presidents. Okay, so they're giving this Catholic view that if Catholics are controlling America, then why aren't there more Catholic presidents? Why is John F. Kennedy the only Catholic president? Etc. That's one of the arguments that they make. Now, I would relate that to one of the teachings of the Jesuits back, or the maxims of the order back in the 19th century, where they said at their meeting in Chieri, Italy, they said, let our work be in secret, let us shun too much light. They didn't want to have too much light on them. They didn't want to draw too much attention to themselves. So they tend to maintain a more subdued role. They're going to be behind the scenes. They don't want anybody to know really who they are. Not really. You kind of, you know they're there, but you don't really know much about them. That's what they want. They want to be the unseen hand. Then the article, of course, goes on to talk about Wild Bill Donovan, which is predictable, of course, that he's really where a lot of this Catholic involvement in the CIA and what they're now calling the deep state. He's really where it begins in many ways, and they point that out in this article. And they say that Wild Bill did not exclusively recruit Catholics. He sought anyone with ability, but many Catholics ended up in the OSS. It's impossible to know for certain why this happened. And then it goes on from there. I don't think it's really impossible to know. I think there was a Catholic/Vatican dynamic. See, what I think was going on, this is one of the tactics of Rome, is Rome would typically has people on both sides of any conflict. Both sides of any conflict. That way, whoever wins, they have a foothold in that person's camp. So if two countries are at war, the Jesuits are going to have people operating both for and against both countries. They're going to have people in power, if they can, in both countries, because somebody's going to win the conflict. And when the winner emerges, they want to have their people there so that they can continue their influence. Now, here's kind of an example in this same article. It talks about Catholic anti-communism in the 1940s and 50s was at its zenith. Major Catholic organizations such as the Knights of Columbus supported Senator Joseph McCarthy, himself a Catholic. Not just a Catholic, McCarthy was a Jesuit-trained and manipulated Catholic. He was literally put up to do the things he was doing by a Jesuit priest. In fact, there's an article out there called McCarthy's Jesuit. You can go read about Edmund Walsh, who was the Jesuit who manipulated McCarthy. Now, of course, the Jesuits are also promoting communism. So why are they both for it and against it? My belief is the reason they pushed McCarthy the way they did, they knew that McCarthy, they wanted him to be extreme and unreasonable because they wanted him to crash and burn. That's what I believe. Because people associated any opposition to communism, they associated it with McCarthy's extremism. But what that did was it allowed these communists to get into our schools, colleges, universities, into our system, etc., and anybody who would try to stop them or question them is now associated with McCarthy's extremist bigotry. So you had, yes, on the one hand, there were Catholics opposing communism and Jesuits opposing communism, but then many other Jesuits promoting communism. But it's interesting, coming back to our scripture verse in Revelation, how the woman rides the beast. You think about somebody riding a horse or an animal. They pull the reins both to the left and to the right. Both sides, both directions. Interesting. All right, show, we are going to talk, well, we're really going to kind of do a follow-up show to a show we did earlier on the CIA as the Catholic Intelligence Agency. The Catholic Intelligence Agency. Today, we're calling this show U.S. Intelligence and the Vatican. Maybe we could call it U.S. Intelligence and Vatican Spies. But we're going to get to that here in a minute. The story of a Vatican spy, or what was seen as really an OSS spy working in the Vatican and feeding all sorts of information to our intelligence network, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. And there's all sorts of controversy. This is a new piece of information that I've stumbled across. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Why do I think that is important? Because you have the ongoing conflict with the deep state. With the deep state. I mean, look at some of these headlines here. You have here at Breitbart talking about what is going on with the Trump administration. And you have one of the headlines at Breitbart, Clinton campaign colluded with nearly every top official at the DOJ and the FBI. All right, so you got the Clinton campaign meeting with the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Here's another headline from InfoWars. Trump said apparently, he said, the FBI and the DOJ had a program to prevent my presidency. And so much of the evidence that's coming out is leaning in that direction. We talked about Agent Strzok with the FBI before, how he was sending messages talking about how they were going to stop Trump from getting elected, and on and on and on. That there was a deep state attempt to prevent the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States and to get Hillary into the White House. All of that seems to make a lot of sense. How it turned about, the only thing I can think is that because so many people blew the whistle on election rigging before the election happened, and especially Trump while he was a candidate. As candidate Trump, before the election, he was coming out and telling the media his concerns that the election would be rigged in favor of Hillary. And of course, President Obama scoffed at that. Hillary scoffed at that. Everybody was so indignant that Trump would even mention the idea that the election could be compromised or rigged, and on. And I mean, they were just, how dare he even say such a thing? And so, but what I think happened was it created an environment of greater carefulness. They had to be careful, whatever was going on, because there's a lot of evidence that the Democrats were trying to steal the election. But whatever it was that they were planning to do, or whatever it was that they did, and I'm not sure that we can fully know, whatever it was, they had to be a lot more careful about it, because there were people with iPhones all over the country monitoring the election as it was happening and reporting anything that looked or seemed suspicious. And Trump won, as we know. He won. And then we've had all this craziness from then to now. But globalism, there's no question that everything that Trump represents and his administration and the whole Make America Great Again, and let's put a stop to illegal immigration and the flooding of our country, and really Trump is not just speaking against flooding our country with Muslims. He's speaking against this practice over in Western Europe. He thinks that the governments of Western Europe are making a huge mistake and that all of this needs to be turned about. And of course, they've got an ongoing struggle over there over Brexit and whether or not Brexit is going to go through. There are reports about many of the Brexiteer politicians jumping ship and changing their position and this kind of thing, that this is going to turn out to be a big betrayal. Who knows where all of that's going to end up? But there's no question that the globalists are fighting tooth and nail to try and keep whatever power they've gained up to now. And they're using their racism and bigotry campaign and all this other kind of stuff against anybody who opposes them. Which is pretty standard. I mean, at this point, once you have heard one leftist argument, you have heard virtually all of them. That the problem with any opposition is that everybody is a racist and a bigot, and that's the real problem. That's what this is about. All right, now let's go to the story here, because the Vatican plays prominently, on the world stage, and which is not a surprise, should not be a surprise to us at all. We read in the book of Jeremiah, God telling his people to flee out of the midst of Babylon, the great destruction and the fall of Babylon. And part of it seems to apply to ancient Babylon, but there also seems to be a future destruction that has not been fulfilled historically. And of course, the reformers, our reformed forefathers, believe generally that the complete fulfillment of the destruction of Babylon the Great happens in Revelation 17 and 18, chapter 18 in particular, which is where we read about Babylon the Great falling in Revelation 18, where it says in verse 9, It says, "And the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more." And then it goes on to talk about the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and of pearls and of fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and all thyine wood and all manner vessels of ivory and all manner vessels of most precious wood and of brass and iron and marble and cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine and oil and fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men. And souls of men. That last reference there. The last item on the list of merchandise, because that's how it begins. The merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones, etc. And so the merchandise of the souls of men. Think about Rome. Think about the selling of indulgences for the forgiveness of sins. Think about the selling, the mass cards that they sell in Rome to this day. The mass cards that you pay so that they'll say a special mass to get somebody's soul out of purgatory. Merchandising the souls of men. It continues right up to this very day with Rome. It's just incredible. The Scripture and the fulfillment of Scripture that we see in the witness of history. But as Dr. H. Grattan Guinness wrote back in the 19th century, there is a reason why we are warned in the Scripture about this city that sits upon 7 hills. The woman is that great city that sits upon 7 hills and reigneth over the kings of the earth. There is a reason why we're warned about it. And we of course, there are so many different evils that are going on in the world, so many different forms of corruption that are happening. But there's a reason why God inspired John to set down this particular warning about Mystery Babylon, this mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And, of course, I think we see the reason why throughout the pages of church history, right up into modern times. Now, let's talk about what's going on with the American intelligence community. My impression of American history, even though our history is not perfect, certainly, there in terms of the Bible-based Christian focus of America, if you study our history going back to the colonies, with the development of the English Protestant colonies, there's no question that Protestantism was the overwhelming majority of the belief, variant forms of Protestantism in the early American colonies. In fact, we're documenting this for our new film on the true Christian history of America, where we talk about the different state constitutions and the requirement from one state after another that you had to be a member, a believer in the Protestant religion. Over and over and over again. It would say Protestant, Protestant, Protestant. Sam Adams signs a declaration. He calls it political Protestantism. And so on. And there's a reason why. Because Protestantism, historic Protestantism, is intended to be Bible-based Christianity, plainly put. So you have a Protestant history. We carry the book by Dr. Ronald Cook on the de-Protestantizing of America. This is one way to look at our history. And that there's an overwhelming number of Catholic judges sitting on the Supreme Court. Now, we've talked about this before. You can people write articles on this. That you've got and even Gorsuch, even though Gorsuch is not technically Catholic, he was still trained by Jesuits at a Jesuit prep school. So there is an incredible presence of Rome that has grown in our political system and in the intelligence community since the end of World War II. So we have a Bible-based, very strong Bible-based Christian history all the way up through World War II. After the Second World War, things begin to change. By the time you get to Korea, our country loses its focus, I believe, with the Korean War. But then from there, we get into the Vietnam War, and the situation is completely confusing. We don't know why we're in Vietnam. Well, we kind of do, supposedly to oppose communism. We're there fighting. We've got guys in the jungle. But nobody has a plan to actually win, to actually bring this conflict to a conclusion and win anything. And so much of what's happening has to do with powers at work behind the scenes manipulating in ways that our country hadn't been manipulated before that. And I believe the reason for it is because the deep state, the CIA, the intelligence community had been subverted by Rome through the Second World War. From the time of the Vatican, I stumbled upon an article published by the Washington Post back in 1980. So this is an article from 1980. And the headline reads, U.S. blessed with OSS spy in Vatican. United States, that is, blessed with an OSS spy in the Vatican. This is from August 3rd, 1980. Then it goes on to talk about this spy, Virgilio Scatolini, who went to work for the Vatican in mid-1944 and also went to work for the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. So Scatolini also went to work for the Office of Strategic Services, wartime precursor of the Central Intelligence Agency. Overnight, Scatolini became a prize agent of the OSS. His reports were so prolific and valuable that the OSS kept one man in Italy doing nothing but translating and cabling them to Washington. 1944. So this is during the Second World War. And there's all of this information from this agent who's working at the Vatican and working for the OSS. Now, the incredible thing is, you read this article, come to find out, the information that's being fed by this guy to Washington, D.C. turns out to be bogus. That's the incredible thing. Turns out to be bogus. And the way that they unfold the story from there is very interesting, because I personally think that the reason it was bogus is because the guy was really working for the Vatican. But that's not really what's communicated in this article by the Washington Post. The Washington Post gives you the impression that the guy was just working for himself. He was just a self-promoter who happened to get in with the Vatican, happened to get in with the OSS, and then turned out to be a fraud. And all of this was uncovered by, guess who? Well, a Jesuit historian figured this whole thing out. A Jesuit historian named Robert A. Graham. The whole thing is very, very suspicious. But here's what I want to share with you. This is from an article published on a website called churchandstate.org in the UK. churchandstate.org.uk. And the headline of the article is The CIA and the Vatican's Intelligence Apparatus. Now, this is an article that goes back to 1983, was originally published in the political commentary Mother Jones. Now, we all know, anybody who knows Mother Jones knows that is a liberal, progressive publication. But it is back in 1983, before they went off the rails. But here's what they say in this article about the CIA and the Vatican's intelligence apparatus, just so we understand. Other sources, including the History Channel and President George H.W. Bush, have said that the Vatican's intelligence network is faster and more reliable than our own CIA. That's a comment made during the Reagan administration by George H.W. Bush when the Pope was working with Reagan, etc. Okay, that's one of the comments. And I've seen in other documentaries when they talk about the intelligence network that they talk about how the Vatican has the most vast, the most extensive intelligence network really in the world. And if you study the history of it, it goes back to the time of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, probably even earlier than that. But once the Jesuits come along, and they're this military order, and they adopt spying, and they adopt infiltrating other churches, basically sending in Jesuits as secret agents, sending them in as Calvinists, sending them in as Baptists, sending them in as Lutherans, etc., adopting all professions of faith and reportedly every area of society. And this is not just some strange conspiracy theory. This was documented by people like J.A. Wiley, the historian in the 19th century, and even talked about by men like John Adams, President John Adams. There's a quote from him about how once the Jesuits were reformed in the 19th century, he says, we're going to have them here in as many disguises as only a king of the gypsies can assume. Quote from President John Adams. But how did Rome gain control of our intelligence apparatus? Well, let me read you the introduction to this article here on the Vatican and the CIA. Listen to this. Okay, quote, one day in July 1944, as the Second World War raged throughout Europe, General William Wild Bill Donovan was ushered into an ornate chamber in Vatican City for an audience with Pope Pius XII. Pope Pius XII was also called Hitler's Pope. Okay, side note. The article goes on. Donovan bowed his head reverently as the pontiff intoned a ceremonial prayer in Latin and decorated him with the Grand Cross of the Order of St. Sylvester, the oldest and most prestigious of papal knighthoods. This award has been given to only 100 other men in history who, by feat of arms or writings or outstanding deeds, have spread the faith and have safeguarded and championed the Church. Meaning, obviously, the Catholic Church. Okay, now, goes on. It says, although a papal citation of this sort rarely, if ever, states why a person is inducted into the Golden Militia, there can be no doubt that Donovan earned his knighthood by virtue of the services he rendered to the Catholic hierarchy in World War II, during which he served as the chief of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. In 1941, the year before the OSS was officially constituted, Donovan forged a close alliance with Father Felix Morleon, founder of a European Catholic intelligence service known as Pro Dio. All right, so then the article goes on to talk about how Pro Dio, that Father Morleon was, the Germans overran Western Europe. Then it says that Donovan helped Morleon move his base of operations from Lisbon to New York. And then from then on, it says Pro Dio was financed by Donovan. In other words, financed by the OSS, by us, America, who believed that such an expenditure would result in valuable insight into the secret affairs of the Vatican, then a neutral enclave in the midst of fascist Rome. Calling the Vatican a neutral enclave. That is a rather strange comment from Mother Jones. It makes me question the intent of Mother Jones and how they're writing this article. Why? Because the Vatican, first of all, was propped up by Mussolini. It was Mussolini who reinstated the papacy. The papacy had come to an end back in the 19th century. It was null and void. Then it was disempowered. Now it's reinstated by Mussolini. in 1929. And then he gives it all kinds of money. He gives all kinds of money to Vatican City. That's the reason Vatican City exists as its own nation state today. Then Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, he was the guy who directed the Catholic Center Party to give Hitler his totalitarian power in Germany in exchange for Hitler signing a concordat, a political agreement with Rome, with the Vatican. So here the Vatican has two very strong alliances with both Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy. How the Vatican could be seen as neutral in the midst of all that, I have no idea. That's a very strange comment from Mother Jones. But the article does go on to say, further down, it says, quote, Pope Pius's decoration of Wild Bill Donovan marked the beginning of a long-standing, intimate relationship between the Vatican and U.S. intelligence that continues to the present day. Okay? They said this again. They're writing this back in 1983. But nothing has significantly changed from 1983 to the present day, just in terms of the relationship with the Vatican. So it stands to reason that that relationship continues even now. Let's talk about America versus socialism. America versus socialism. This is based in part on a comment by House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who has said that it is no longer just Republicans versus Democrats, it's America versus socialism. No longer America versus Democrats, it's America versus socialism. And, of course, this is what many of us have been talking about for several years. It's just incredible how a movement that was operating in the underground for the longest time, I mean, during the McCarthy era, of course, back in the 1950s, there was a lot of talk about the Reds and the Red Dawn and Red Invasion and all this other kind of stuff, and what's going to happen if the communists try to invade the country. And, of course, there were people who knew we had communists here. But through the end of the Cold War and Ronald Reagan and the fall of the Soviet Union, it seems pretty clear. I mean, I remember distinctly having a concern for Marxism as a threat, and then that threat seeming to disappear once you get through Ronald Reagan and the fall of the Soviet Union and the incredible failure of communism as a system to be able to sustain a country and a people. It just simply does not have the ability to do it. And, of course, many people don't realize that the Soviet Union was propped up by the United States and Great Britain, and without the U.S. and Great Britain, the Soviet Union would not have been possible. In fact, many of these communist countries, China right now, I honestly believe that if America said, we're not going to support China, we're not buying all of this made-in-China garbage anymore, let them distribute to their own people, and we're going to buy American from now on. If we did things that way, I think it would enrich America, but it would hurt China. It would hurt their system. I don't think it would hurt us if we just said, okay, we're not going to import all this stuff from other countries. We're just going to buy from the American business owner. We're going to buy locally. We're going to buy nationally. We're not going to import all these foreign cars and all this other kind of stuff. We're not going to do that anymore. And I think America would survive and do well. I mean, international trade sounds like a good idea, and I guess a certain amount of it is not bad. I mean, I know our little ministry, we send out orders to other countries, and of course, we like the idea of doing business with other countries. The problem is with international Marxism and globalism, there is a very deliberate effort to try and take down the free world and to take down America. And they use economics as one of their weapons. Just look at what they did to the UK. I mean, they just really wrecked parts of the UK economy, made things very difficult for people there. You watch the documentary Brexit, they explain it. But let me read some of these comments here from House Majority Leader Representative Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican out of California. He said, quote, "The debate today is different than the one we had before with Republicans versus Democrats on the size of what government can be." He said, it's no longer Republicans versus the Democrats, it's America versus socialism. The movement in this Democratic Party toward clear socialism, that's what they're doing on health care, government run. It's all government telling you what to do and when to do it instead of unshackling and unleashing the great powers of liberty and freedom. Well, that should not be a big surprise for anybody who's been paying attention. Now, the good news is, there's bad news and good news, I think. The good news is that this is now something that is being talked about in the mainstream, and your mainstream patriots understand it. You can go home and tell mom and dad, you can tell your family about this, and they'll listen to you because they're seeing it on TV continually. That's a very good thing. I remember when I first started doing a lot of this research 20 years ago, you try to talk to people about what was going on and what these globalists are doing behind the scenes, and you mention a phrase like the New World Order, and of course everybody thinks you're wacko, thinks you're completely nuts. Today, not so much. Today, people are much more open to listening because they see what's happened. And especially after 8 years of having Barack Obama in the White House, where it became obvious to people after 8 years of Obama that our country was being manipulated, we were being lied to, that the Obama administration was imposing things on the country against the will of the American people, and all this other kind of stuff. And you had Hollywood and leftist media, they were all in the tank. And anything that would be called objectivity from the people who before had been known as journalists, whatever kind of objectivity they may have possibly had went completely out the window. It was gone. It's completely gone. I remember Brian Williams years ago, long before Obama, when he was a much younger journalist. And I remember watching an interview with him, and they were asking him about his political views. And he said, he says, I've got friends who will ask me, he said, who I voted for in a certain election. And he says, I never tell them. He says, I never tell my friends, I never tell anyone who I voted for in an election. He said, because as a journalist, it's so important that I maintain objectivity and a neutral worldview. Words to that effect. I'm paraphrasing him, obviously. But I'll never forget watching that interview. And this was back when journalists were seen for a time in our country. Back in the 1970s and 80s, journalists were almost like lawyers in a sense. That a lawyer, or a doctor, a doctor takes an oath to do all that he can to save life. A lawyer takes an oath to do all that he or she can to defend their client, to do everything that's lawful to defend their client with objectivity. And journalists were kind of seen the same way. Now, of course, this is before the internet. And journalists were seen as, if you're a true journalist, you are neutral, you are simply reporting what the news is. You're not there to tell people what to think about it per se, simply to report the information so the American people can be informed. I mean, that used to be at least the expected standard of journalism. Now today, they've completely thrown that out the window. There doesn't seem to be anybody who's doing that. Nobody is simply reporting facts and information. Everybody's involved in some kind of propaganda, one way or the other. So it's incredible how things have changed, at least from my perspective. Now, then you get into the education system. Here's an article from Front Page Mag, and they're reporting now on this is the reason why My wife and I got out of California when we had our first two children, and before they started school, we did not want them educated in the state of California, so we got out of there. But here's an article on Front Page Mag. It says, crude, anti-white, anti-male, anti-Christian communists indoctrinate California K through 12 students. Then you got a leftist group called Just Communities. Just as in justice, right? And they're always talking about justice, but of course their form of justice is injustice. And so they have a $250,000 contract with Santa Barbara educators to brainwash students. Now, they have a bundle of documents that they produced, and they use these documents, they use these tables and forms and things like this to indoctrinate the kids in the schools out in California. And we don't have time to go over all of them. But here is one of the documents that I want to read from. This shows a table. You can go online and look at the article. But it shows a table, and the headline, the title for the table is Forms of Oppression. Forms of oppression. Okay? But notice how they frame the argument. Some people are being oppressed. And what is the oppression? Well, they have the form of oppression, then they have the privilege group, and then they have the target group. Obviously, the privilege group is the oppressor. The target group is the group that's being oppressed. So, for example, they have their first example, sexism. The form of oppression is sexism. The privilege group is men, and the target group is women. So women are being oppressed by men who are the privileged group here. Then you have the next form of oppression, which is racism. The privileged group is white people, and the target group is people of color. The next they have heterosexism. The privileged group is heterosexual people, and then the target group is LGBTQ people. Okay, and then it goes down from there. The last category, the last form of oppression is religious oppression. The privileged group is Christian people, and the target group is all others. All others are supposedly being oppressed by Christians in America. Now, what's incredible about this brainwashing is that even secular groups and universities and so on have done studies, objective studies, where when they study people in the world, groups in the world that are being oppressed and persecuted, like real persecution, the number one group anywhere in the world, over and over and over again, from studies that have been done for the last 20, 30 years, the most persecuted people anywhere in the world, hands down, are Christian people, without any question. There is no other group of people who are routinely targeted and killed. None of these other groups that are claiming that they somehow or other are being oppressed and people are chasing after them and all this other kind of stuff, none of them have their members lined up out on a beach somewhere with a bunch of Muslim guys in hoods and knives, lining them all up and then cutting all of their heads off on camera and bragging and boasting about it to the rest of the world just because of who they are and what they believe. That happens to Christians. And it happens to Christians continually. In fact, there is an article on the Geller Report by Hugh Fitzgerald. Hugh Fitzgerald has two articles called Beyond Boko Haram, Nigeria's Other Genocide. And here's what he says at one point. He says, quote, while all eyes seem to be elsewhere on North Korea, on Iran, and the attack at Avaz on the UK, floundering over how to settle its Brexit affairs, and the U.S. floundering over a Supreme Court nomination, in Nigeria, there is an ongoing jihad against Christians. It is not that of Boko Haram. This genocide, the deliberate killing of men, women, and children because they are Christian, and the destruction of their dwellings, the stealing of their cattle, has accounted for many thousands of victims, with hundreds in the last 2 months. All right, brethren, let's go ahead in Nigeria by Muslims. Now, remember, brethren, part of the reason this is happening, and I think it's the chief reason this is happening, is because the country, Nigeria, had been governed by a Christian president named Goodluck Jonathan, who undoubtedly would have helped to protect the Christian population from these Islamic uprisings and random attacks and this kind of thing. But then, when Barack Obama was in the White House, Barack Obama used his influence to help put a Muslim in charge of Nigeria instead of the Christian president. In fact, Obama did this over and over again in a whole variety of different countries. He used his influence to promote Islamic leaders, quite often against Christians, to have Muslims in power instead of Christians. And Nigeria is one of those countries. And right now, whenever you're seeing these attacks on Christians, the Muslims, of course, feel emboldened because the guy they put in charge is some radical, some Muslim extremist who promotes Sharia law and this kind of thing. And obviously, he is not. He's just like all these other Muslim leaders who are in charge of countries that have a relationship with the United States and historically Christian countries where they're getting financial aid and support and all this other kind of stuff. What they do is they say, well, of course, we support religious freedom. That's what they say. But then they don't do that. Then what happens is their populations, their Muslim population, will go around victimizing the Christians, burning their churches down, kidnapping and raping their women and children, this kind of thing. And the government simply does not do anything about it. They let it happen. And so I believe that has everything to do with what's going on. In fact, there's an article on the Daily Post from last year. Here's the headline. It says, How Obama Helped Buhari. Buhari is the Nigerian president, the Muslim guy. How Obama helped Buhari defeat me in 2015 election, Jonathan. Meaning, that's a quote from Goodluck Jonathan. And it says, former President Goodluck Jonathan has claimed that he lost the 2015 presidential elections because of a conspiracy between the USA, Britain, and France. In a new book, the title of which is Against the Run of Play, authored by the chairman of This Day editorial board, Goodluck Jonathan said former U.S. President Barack Obama, ex-British Prime Minister David Cameron, and French President Hollande helped President Buhari win the election. And if you read the whole article, they really lay most of the blame on Obama. They say it was really the Obama administration that was even pressuring both England and France against Goodluck Jonathan, the Christian, to get this Muslim guy in power, Buhari. All right, here's another article. This is from the Canada Free Press. Now, some of you will remember that the reason Justin Trudeau, who is a socialist, and he's really like the white Canadian Obama, because he is a socialist. He's very pro-Islam. You can go online, find photos of him kneeling in a mosque, wearing Islamic-looking clothing, even though he's supposedly not actually a Muslim. But he's very, very friendly and supportive toward the Muslims and bringing them into Canada and all this other kind of stuff, and promoting all of these left-wing programs. And it is said that the Obama administration was directly involved. In fact, I was in Canada last year talking to some of the people there and talking to people on the plane who were Canadians. And their position was, oh yeah, you're Obama. Yeah, we pretty much took it for granted that he was responsible for Trudeau. Yeah. And so they kind of take that for granted there, that's what happened. So the Obama administration was very actively involved with making sure that socialists and Muslims were in power in a whole variety of countries. So here they've got an article on the Canada Free Press, and this is from 2015. It says Obama, and this was during the Obama administration, and it says Obama installing Islam leaders while Michelle and Susan Rice provide cover? ? And then the article says, quote, the full-scale social engineering of President Barack Hussein Obama in the elections of countries where he has no business being seeks to install radical Islamists to power. Goes on and says, even though it's a provable deadly blueprint that's putting the West at great risk, no one is calling him on it. Obama's been on the trail of replacing Christian leaders with Islamic ones before he became president, starting with Kenya, where he actively campaigned to elect Islamic defender Raila Odinga in 2007. All right, and then it goes on to talk about that. It says, millions revolted in Egypt when Obama's so-called Arab Spring led to the election of Muslim Brotherhood big gun Mohammed Morsi. And the subsequent election of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has been the largest setback. Why? Because al-Sisi is said to be more moderate. He is a Muslim, but he is more moderate. He's not the radical that his opposition is. And then it goes on to talk about how, so that was a failed attempt by the Obama administration. He also had a failed attempt with Israel when they tried to block the re-election of Prime Minister Netanyahu. That didn't work. But then the article goes on, it says, quote, no one paid Obama and his Marxist minions any attention when they backed Hassan Qattara against Christian challenger Laurent Gbagbo in the Ivory Coast election back in 2011. Obama congratulated Qattara on his election victory, even though his troops slaughtered 1,000 Christians in a post-election bloodbath. Okay? Then the article goes on to talk about Obama's interference in Nigeria. And actually, this article was written right before the election in Nigeria took place. But it makes it very clear, Canada Free Press makes it very clear that Barack Obama was supporting the interests of Muslims ahead of Christianity, ahead of Christian leaders. And of course, he can't be completely ignorant of the fact that Christians are relentlessly persecuted by Muslims. They're kidnapped, they're raped, they're murdered, they're beheaded, everything else. It is, you can almost guarantee that if you've got a country like Nigeria, where about half the population is Christian and the other half is Muslim, if you put a Muslim leader in charge of that country, the Muslim side of the country will be emboldened to go out and victimize the Christians repeatedly. That is what happens. But you don't have it the other way around. Christians don't go around burning all the mosques to the ground. You don't have stories about Christians slaughtering thousands of Muslims who were just sitting there minding their own business. You don't have these kind of stories. If Christians were doing that, those stories would be all over the place in mainstream media. You'd have people talking about it all day, but it doesn't happen because that's simply not the general character of Christianity toward the other groups of people in the world. Generally speaking, that's not how Christians treat people of other beliefs. But we should be in prayer for the believers in Nigeria and pray for persecuted Christians around the world. This is what the Lord told us would happen, brethren. We have to remember. Jesus said, you will be hated by all men for my name's sake. And we're warned of persecution. In the world ye shall have tribulation, the Lord said. But be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. Praise the Lord.